Good morning. Hello and welcome to today's GovMates Institute. As everybody is jumping in here and getting started this lovely Thursday morning, today's Institute is on leveraging OTAs as a tool for growth. And for those of you who have joined us for an Institute here before, welcome back. We're virtual yet again, and we're glad to see you this morning. I am the voice here. I am Meg Kearns, the Director of Engagement for GovMates, and I'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A so that our speakers and our moderator can focus on your questions and getting you the information that you need. So to get us comfortable and set up for today's discussion, I'd like to provide a few participation reminders for those who may be new to ensure your best experience here. The first one would be to remove those distractions. It's early yet. I know you're probably in your email, but if you can go ahead and close down some of those unnecessary browser windows, we're going to try and keep this to about an hour. So silence that phone, close down the 8 tabs on your device, or try to stay out of that email if you can. We also encourage you to be active in the chat. So you should see a Q&A button along the bottom of your screen, as well as a chat box at the bottom right of your screen. If you'll go ahead and give that chat box a quick test run, we would appreciate it. So first in the dropdown above the text box, you should choose to all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, only I will be able to see your comments. So make sure that everybody else can hear you or see you, and let us know where you're joining from this morning. Bonus points as always if you're on a fall vacation somewhere wonderful. You can also take this time to share a bit of your digital business card in that chat box. So your name, email, company name, should people in the audience want to connect with you post-event. Finally, there will be a replay. We'll send over the replay to the email address that you use to register once it processes post-event. So this is where, and I see some people jumping in there, thank you so much. This is where I get to have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for today's discussion, Stephanie Alexander. Stephanie is the co-founder of GovMates, and she will be taking the reins to introduce and guide our panelists through the conversation and the questions that you will have. So thank you so much, Stephanie, for bringing all of us together to discuss today, and I'm going to throw it right over to you.
Thanks, Meg. Welcome. Hello, GovMate Nation. How are we today? If you are on your fall vacation, I strongly suggest that you hang up and get the replay. When Meg said that, I'm like, nobody wants to be on vacation watching a webinar. So you're in the wrong type of vacation if you are. But for those of you who are actively working and hopefully not multitasking too much, our goal is to talk to you in the next hour about leveraging OTAs as a tool for growth. So there is a lot of jargon out there. There's a lot of what is this OTA thing? This is not a webinar about OTA 101. There are a lot of great resources out there. So this is a webinar kind of more for after you've already learned what the OTA is. And we'll touch on that for a second, but more how you can use it to grow your company. We are here to provide you value, which hopefully you can take into 2022 as you're doing your pipeline building and your budgeting, because 'tis the season for budgeting. So I am super excited to announce our guests today. And as usual, we will go around the horn and I will be asking them our famous question, for which I love to grill people. Thankfully, we've made it easy on me because we have Bob, Jason, and Jim. So I realize that we have the easiest names in the world today, which I appreciate. So let's get it started with Bob. Bob, who are you and what makes you an expert in your field, sir? And thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's a real pleasure, Stephanie. I really enjoy the opportunity to talk to the folks that are out there about something I'm very passionate about. So passionate that I'm even doing it in my retirement. I am the retired Chief Operating Officer of Advanced Technology International, which is the oldest and largest consortium management firm in the United States. And what makes me an expert in this area? Well, let's start with another revelation about my age. I've been in the government R&D business for 46 years. So I started in the 70s, working in what we call the black world. Came out of the cold and into what now is the white world, and ended up being the senior executive in charge of science and technology planning and programming in the Department of Defense, where I first ran across OTs when DARPA was doing the technology reinvestment program in the 90s, and started using OTs at that time to inspire commercial organizations who didn't really want to work with the government to come work for the government on dual use technologies back then. Left DOD in 2001, went to work eventually for another nonprofit that did a lot of research. I was the deputy director of the Homeland Security's federally funded Research and Development Center for Analysis, and then came to ATI. So that's the second part of my CV, which makes me an expert. I was lucky enough to get involved in at ATI during their period of largest growth. I think we went from somewhere around $500 million of federal funds that we managed for on behalf of the federal government to over 5 billion before I left. And I think they're going to do about something around 6 or 7 billion this year. That in that time, I just became very, very excited about the whole consortium, OT consortium business model, because it did things that in my 45 years, I had a terrible time getting done when I was in the government and I was around the government. And that's really get things done very well and very fast, not just fast. I know everybody gets impressed with speed, but the work that gets done is done very well too, because of the collaboration, which is the most important aspect of it. And so as I like to tell people, the reason I'm still doing this is because I'm excited about a business model that has really the only capability for us to stay ahead of the technology refresh cycles of our adversaries. And it makes me very excited to be involved in it.
Well, thank you, Bob. I appreciate it. Thank you for getting out of retirement for at least an hour or off the golf course and talking to us. You're clearly passionate about it and have a lot of years, a few, of experience.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Jason, who are you and what makes you an expert in your field?
Hey, Stephanie and the rest of the gang. I really appreciate you having me on. I'm honored that you would consider me an expert. I've never been an expert at anything. So I'm kind of the
I find that hard to believe, Jason. Come on.
Jack of all trades and master of none is kind of been my motto. But I'm actually, so what's exciting to me about the OTA consortiums is really this, and Bob hit on it, and it's the collaboration. And that really goes a long way with me and with Alluvionic. We've had some great successes in one particular of the consortiums, and I think really it's the collaboration piece. So when I say I've seen it from both government contracting from both sides. I'm a retired Air Force officer, and so at the remainder of my career, I had the opportunity to be the source selection authority on a standard DFARS contract, and to be honest, it was painful. It's a painful process because we released an RFP. We thought we knew what we wanted. And then all industry could, we had an industry day, before it was released, and the full, process, great questions, good conversations. And then the RFP goes out and then you're in the silent world. And the collaboration kind of stops at that point, which I think is unfortunate because industry didn't have the opportunity to answer back about, hey, now that we see the RFP, we see these 5 things or 6 things that could be slightly different, maybe a little better. What do you think? You can't have those conversations in a DFARS contract. And so that's what's worked really well for us now, being on the outside, on the civilian side, and being involved in the consortiums. We're able to have a more free and open discussion with the technical POCs in an OTA opportunity that's out there. And so our successes have really been being able to talk back and forth and really understand what the customer needs. So a lot of the things that Bob hit on there, I would completely agree with. So I guess not an expert in much, but I think that's what I bring to the conversation today.
Jason, keep us on the straight and narrow here. The OTA type vehicles have been very useful in your company's growth, correct? And
That's
so speaking
correct.
From industry, I mean, it's been something that you've been successful in leveraging those for continued growth.
We've we've had some great successes both in winning a contract through that vehicle, but also really kind of being able to showcase our technical expertise to the government in 1 or 2 that maybe we didn't win, but we had great collaboration along the way, and through some of the industry partnerships that we put together to answer back to one of those opportunities, that's provided some real growth and strong relationships as well.
Very, very cool. All All right, last but absolutely not least, jack of all trades in my mind, because he's been a panelist on more than one GovMates Institute. That's how high we think very highly of him. Well, Jim, who are you and what makes you an expert in your field?
I'm an expert at doing GovMate panels, I think, is
Yes,
the
you
first
are.
thing. Thanks,
Indeed.
Stephanie, and looking forward to this conversation with Bob and Jason and you, and thank you all for coming. My background, I'm currently a director at Wolf Den Associates. I've been here about 5 years. Prior to that, I spent 17 years in government, almost exclusively at GSA, where I was the contract program manager, not a contracting officer, but a program manager for Alliant, the GWACs in general, all of them, and then Oasis, other large scale federal procurements. So I've got a very solid background in sort of the program side of acquisition. And since I've been at Wolf Den, we are a company that helps other companies grow. We've got a wide variety, hundreds of customers, private sector, from companies just getting ready to dip their toe in federal GovCon to $40 billion SIs. And so a lot of what we do is keep track of the market, keep track of federal procurement trends, helping our customers use all of the options, including OTAs. And so hopefully what I'm going to bring today is a sense of, at least based on our market research and what we've observed, how OTAs are being used and best practices around that from sort of a 30,000 foot view, as opposed to Bob and Jason are kind of down in the trenches with this stuff. So it should be fun.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you all for joining us. As everyone can tell, we've got both industry represented, although all of you have former government experience, which means you've been on the dark side and you've got insider intel sometimes. So we've got industry represented, we've got an actual consortium management manager represented, and then we have the overall like big picture trending analysis consulting within government contracting. So we wanted to have a robust conversation and get all sides of the equation as people are looking to these vehicles for their growth opportunities for next year. So let us start off, as I just mentioned, you all have very different perspectives. I'm going to throw this out to anyone, and this kind of gets our juices flowing. How can a company best utilize OTAs, like whether it be via consortium model or whether it be just a direct award? And that's open to anybody. Get us started.
Well, I think the main advice that I would give to companies is to remember that OTAs are not some magic bullet. It's not some, get rich quick scheme where you can now avoid all of the bureaucracy and just have millions of dollars handed to you. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about OTAs. They were
Jim, you're a
designed
buzzkill already. What do you mean? I thought that this was going to be outside the FAR. This was going to be the easy money. You mean there's no magic bullet?
I think Bob really hit this on the head, right? Bob and Jason talked about collaboration, not speed, right? It is probably quicker than a lot of, but not all traditional procurements, but the speed is not the answer. And, it's not necessarily a sole source situation either. It's something where you're still competing. You still have to go through certain widgets. The difference is the process and the nature of it. And I'll let Bob and Jason talk more to that. But I think the tip I would give is, like you would with almost any business development strategy, right? You've got to sell what you have. You've got to go out to that federal customer and bring work to the OTA, whether that's through the consortium or individual. You've got to understand the capability. You've got to educate your potential customers about it. Often government program folks may not know how to use an OTA, or contracting shops may have different levels of understanding. You need to understand it. You need to educate your customers on it and bring it to them as an option. If you just sort of sit back, open your bag like Halloween and wait for the OTA money to start falling into it, that's not going to be an effective business model.
Again, buzzkill as always. I love it. I appreciate the candid. And, for everybody else who's just dialed out, sorry, this wasn't the magic bullet you were looking for. Excellent points. Bob, tell us what you were going to say, but I definitely want to touch on the next part about how to educate the customer. But before we jump into that, talk to us about how companies can leverage.
So I think we got to be careful too, that we don't make this all about OTAs either. OTAs are a tool. a very, very good tool. It's like the coolest tool we've had in a long time. It's the one that you always go to and leave all the other tools in the toolbox if you can. But the point is, and this is what I think what Jim was also getting at, is the one thing the tool allows you to do is a lot more free and open collaboration. First with the government. The best part of this, when I'm with small businesses, I frequently ask the question, how many of you have ever gotten an RFP from the government and have no idea what they're really asking for? And every single hand in the audience always raises up. What happens in the case of the OT-based consortia, where we have this really robust collaboration that gets facilitated, frankly, by the consortium management firm, at least in the case of ATI, is that you sit down with the problem and talk about what the art of the possible is in solving the problem, and really get down to understand what the problem is, so that when the request for procurement, if you will, request for project proposals comes out, everybody understands already what they're looking for. So you don't have to waste time with that. And then what happens frankly, in a good consortium management firm like ATI, is then we hold collaborative events between the members, because in 2371B type OTA consortium, which is what we primarily run, you're incentivized to team big businesses with small businesses and non-traditionals. In fact, there's a cost share requirement for traditional contractors if they don't team with a non-traditional that has a significant contribution to the program. And these collaborations build teams that maybe never would have gotten a team before. If I'm a small innovator and I just come up with a pretty hot new technology, I can't usually even get the R&D director of Raytheon to get on the phone. I can't even get an appointment with him generally if I just cold call him. But in the case of a consortia, we actually set the meetings up. We actually, hold these meetings and provide the venue for showcasing your technology to these big integrators, because in the end, these big integrators do have to become involved in a lot of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time, in getting this thing to the field and getting it to work. And so, for instance, we do something we call speed networking, and it is sort of like speed dating for contractors. Where we, in a virtual way nowadays, put together the large integrators who probably be the organization that really implements this thing, with the small businesses with really great innovative ideas, so they can kind of understand each other. I think Jason even referred to that, to be able to showcase what you do in front of these organizations, in facilitated meetings, as opposed to trying to pick up, and do the cold call. And not to belabor this too long, but it's that collaboration and that working together with the government, and then working together and building these terrific teams that may not have been able to get together otherwise, that then gets you the quality and the speed that we're talking about. Because then the proposals look good. That you don't have to, go back out 2 or 3 times to get the right answers, and then everything just moves along a lot faster. So I agree. It's really about the collaboration, and with using OTA as a tool that allows that.
Jason, your perspective?
Yeah, I agree. I think we've probably sold the audience that collaboration is super
Right.
important, and OTAs are a great way to get to that point. I think if I back up maybe a step or so, one of the things, Stephanie, you talked about, what should a business be thinking about as they build their plan out to next year and maybe beyond that, and if OTAs are a tool that they'd want to utilize.
Exactly.
I would second that it probably is a tool you'd want to look at, certainly. I think one of the things that you need to look for, though, and this is where it gets kind of interesting, there's a number of consortiums out there. And I don't remember the number, but I know it's, more than 10 and less than 20, somewhere in that range.
Yes.
And they all kind of have a slightly different flavor to them. Some of them are DoD, many of them are DoD, many are not. So my experience is specifically with the DoD consortiums, but I think it's sometimes tough for small business to know which ones to look at. You can go to the consortium website and it will have a description of the consortium, the types of projects that typically come through the consortium. So you can get a good idea that way. Some of them, but probably one of the limiting factors is you may not. What would be nice is if you could see maybe the last group of RPPs, or requests for prototype project that came through. But you don't typically have access to those unless you're a member. And sometimes that may involve writing a check. So here we are. I throw this out as free advice. Here we are, in the 10th month of the year. So we're past the month of July. So for those that charge, there's usually a half price sale at the end of the year. So rather than spending, I want to say, well, let's say it's 500 normally, and now it's 250, or for small business for some of them. Don't quote me on that price because they're all slightly different. But the point is, you can get in now, hit it at a lower price, hit a couple of industry days between now and the end of the year, maybe get a better sense of what that consortium has to offer, and then decide in December, January if you want to re-up for the following year at full price. So that's a technique that's worked well for us in a couple of consortiums because we really weren't quite sure what they had to offer. So I throw that out there. The other piece about kind of shopping for consortiums, you can usually see a list of their current members, and I think that's very valuable because you'll see a lot of, there may be companies that you want to team with or have teamed with in the past, and so there's kind of strength in a friendly face in the crowd. So it gives you something else to talk about, other opportunities that could be available to you if you have some like-minded companies that are members of a particular consortium. So that's something to look at. And then I think you kind of need to look at it a little bit longer term as well. So I mentioned, hey, it'd be cool if you could jump into an industry day and see what they have to offer. Well, sometimes there may only be one opportunity, or in the case of one of our consortiums that we're actually a really big fan of recently, there were 0 opportunities. There were some nice roundtable discussions that were set up with government. So industry day did have a use, but you kind of have to look at it long term. So there may, just like government contracting, kind of, we fight that war 1 year at a time, right? And so, here we are towards the fiscal year just ended. We're in the next one. Maybe money's not in place for some of these opportunities to hit the point where there's funding behind them yet, but maybe it's coming. I guess my point to it is don't necessarily get frustrated because there's only 1 or 2 opportunities in a particular consortium, because as we get into the first quarter of next calendar year, maybe there'll be 6 or 7. So it's really hard to say. But I guess that would be my advice, is a couple of pieces of advice. I know they don't all necessarily gel with each other. Some of them are conflicting, but I would say just kind of get out there and try to get a sense of what the consortiums offer. And then another point, if you're acquainted with some of the companies that are already members, phone a friend and ask them how things have worked for them. And you probably have a good understanding of what that consortium may have to offer.
I think that's a really good point. So if you see your competitors in there, is 2 schools of thought. One is that's where you need to be because that's where they are. The other school of thought is that is absolutely where you don't want to be because that's where they are too, right? So it's kind of each company has to try it on for size. I love your advice about perhaps join at the end and get a flavor or two. It's a long game. I have a question, taking a step back, whether this revolves around consortiums or not, more, how do you educate your government customer about the use of an OTA vehicle? How do you begin that process, right? Or do you start with the vehicle and then figure out the customer, or do you have your customer and you try to win hearts and minds to get to the vehicle? Because I think that's a huge challenge, right? Anyone have a magical answer that will solve all of our problems? Because I don't. But give me some advice.
I don't have an answer, but I definitely have opinions about that. So here's what's worked well for us in the past is the opportunity came to us through a consortium. We bid on it. We established a great relationship with the customer, and we won that contract. So that was fantastic. Everything worked well. It was a bit of a long game because it was a couple month long process to make that happen. But we gained a valuable friend in the end. I mean, we're still working.
Jason, a couple months in GovCon is not a long game, sir.
Yeah.
That's an easy game. Are you kidding me?
I think it kind of goes back to your thought that it's not like a magical pot of money that you just kind of go trick or treating and it's there. There's still some time involved. But you're right. It's not as long.
That's a short game. A couple months in GovCon. Come on, man.
Yeah. Yeah. So that worked out really well. But what we've not had luck with, so that particular customer, they were new to the OTA as well. This had been their second RPP that they had released. So realize that it's probably a contracting officer representative that's working the contract, and and they're working under a contracting officer. So they're not they may not be as well versed because sometimes it's an additional duty for that person to be the core. So there's a lot of education that happens with them, and they want to make sure that they do it right, which is great. So do we. So we've had to do a little bit of education. Here's what we're seeing that we're able to talk about because this milestone hasn't been hit yet, and they're like, okay, I hear what you're saying, but I need to go back and double check with my contracting officer to make sure I'm doing this correctly. And
Right.
I can certainly appreciate that.
I think it's also important to note that these are not a new vehicle, right? Like we act like it's new and shiny. It's actually not new and shiny. This has been around for a long time.
Yeah,
totally above board. It's not illegal, to your point. Just because we say outside the FAR doesn't mean that it's like crazy town. It's still GovCon. Let's not get too much here. I'm sorry, Jason, what was the rest of your?
I was going to say it may be an older vehicle, but it's new. These are all individuals that are working it, right? So to those individuals, it could be brand new, as in never seen before. And so, there's a learning curve, and it's probably slightly different with each person that you run into on the government side. And some may have zero experience and not even know what you're talking about.
Jim, do you have any opinions on this in terms of what you see in your clients and do you go educate the client or customer and try and get them to the vehicle, or do you start with vehicle and see what comes out?
I mean, we typically, I would start with capability, right? What do we do? What are we selling here, right? What is the solution, the breakthrough, the innovation that we have in hand? And then it's, okay, well, who needs that, right? Where does that play? I've got a drone with a high-res camera on it. Great. ICE could probably use, or CBP could probably use that. The DOD could use that, right? Maybe NASA could use that. Energy could use it to check pipelines, right? Who are the potential customers? Once you identify your customers and you've got your capability, the question in my experience from government was always, that's great. How do I get to you, right? How do I buy it? Because that's not an easy answer, as you know. And OTA, as Bob said, is a great tool. It's a great answer to that question. Hey, you can get this through another trend, an OTA. How do I do that? And then that's where, a one-pager, a short brief, a meeting, walk them through, whether them as a program person, a COR, even a contract shop, right? Is how would I do this? Can we use a consortium? If so, which one? How does that work? Can we do it without the consortia? If so, what is that process? What are the authorizations internally if necessary? What are the boxes we have to check? You may need to walk them through that and almost hold their hand through that process if they've never done it, or refer them to someone who has. There's nothing is better in government than saying that somebody else has already done it, because nobody likes to be the first doing anything, in my experience, especially in contracting. Contracting officers not notably risk tolerant people. And you say, this is something, as you say, it's been around for a long time. It is something that is commonly used. Your colleague over at NavAir just did it 2 weeks ago. Here's what they did, right? And give them that reassurance that they aren't breaking the law or going rogue in doing this. And say, hey, $16 billion a year, in 2021, what flows out of DOD and through OTAs. This is not, like you said, crazy town. I think that's really, at a high level, the approach that we would take.
No, that makes sense. Go ahead, Bob.
I think, though, that we don't want to set up that this is some sort of mutually exclusive set of strategies. I think you should do both. I think you should, if you have access to a customer who might be interested in your technology, then I think you can educate them. And most of these consortia, it depends on, I'm sure we're going to talk about this later. There is a fair amount of variation among contracting organizations as to how they run the consortia. We used to joke, someone asked about this. I think that we're getting close to 30 consortia now, and ATI is privileged to run 15 of them. You've seen one consortia, and so they work a little different. But most of the contracting organizations will take money from other organizations. Sometimes they restrict it to their service, sometimes they don't. The largest one that we have has 70 different sponsoring organizations from all over the government, and so I think that's one thing to remember, is that you can educate your client into and even if his organization isn't involved in OTAs or consortia, you can sometimes move the money to get it done. The other thing is that as a public service, not for profit, we think this mission is important. So ATI actually runs periodic seminars, the OTA 101, like you referred to at one time, really and open to anybody, really meant, though, partially, or actually for the most part, maybe even to educate new government people, or people who are who want to sponsor R&D, and get them to kind of understand what the OTA is. So if you don't feel as a BD person, if you will, for a small business, that you've got the chops to really explain it to your client, then maybe have your client, tune into one of those OTA sessions that we do periodically as a sort of a public service. But I think education is going to be the thing that makes the difference going forward. I think later we'll talk about what the trends are. The trends are growing, but I think they're growing a lot because of a pretty broad-based education program.
Well, actually, that's a really good segue. So let's talk about the trends, right? So we've established that, Jim, why I love you, we are so on the same page. No matter what, you still have to have something that people want to buy, right? Like, that is the fundamental that we cannot get away from. That is every business, every industry, all the things. You still have to have something that people want to buy at a price that they will buy it at. So that is the basic going into this. But assuming that you found this customer, or, you've gone through the consortium, 2 different routes. And I think Bob's point about play all the cards, because they are not mutual. They go after all of it, depending on bandwidth. Where do you see the trending for using these types of vehicles? Maybe even broken out between the civilian space and the DoD space, if you know that information, but how are you seeing contracting officers and the government kind of approach these vehicles?
Yeah, so what we've seen is a significant growth from 15 to 20, 92% growth,
Wow.
back in DoD, just talking about DoD now. There are civilian agencies that do OTAs, but I think the majority of the spend is still in DoD. And like I said, about 16-point-x billion in fiscal year 20. Up from less than $1 billion 5 years ago. So like I said, 92% growth. The vast majority of it is for research and development. There is some spend in services and products, but it's very minimal. I think that, there was a thought at one point, and I saw some of the questions we got ahead of time about using OTAs to get to, products, software, hardware, widget. And that's really not what we're seeing at all. They're being used primarily for research and development. And of that spend, a lot of it, the vast majority of it is going through consortia. And with that being said, through, there's kind of like just a handful that are really taking an outsized proportion, of which ATI is absolutely one. Where we see that money flowing. I think there have been, we've heard that there's been some pushback in different pockets at DoD, sort of looking to get away from the consortium model, to get some of those more direct, kind of one-to-one relationships to the non-traditional. But I think, that may be anecdotally correct, but it will then, rule of anecdote is not data. So, we think that the consortium model is certainly the most prevalent that we see. And outside of DoD, what we really are seeing the consortia around border security. DHS has one out in Silicon Valley. And then, of course, the 3-letter agencies, the IC, are pretty robust users. But I'm sure Bob and Jason have more insight into some of those trends.
Guys, any additional thoughts on this in terms of trending and what you're seeing?
Well, I think what's important about what Jim says, if you pull the string a little farther, is in the case of DoD. Let's just talk about DoD for now. As an old R&D programmer from DoD, I took a look at the DoD budget. And I think Jim said we were something around 16 billion right now, which by the way, is a huge growth just from a couple of years ago. I mean, it's just, you know, only a couple of years ago, it was 4 or 5 billion, you know. If you look at what, in my analysis, is the addressable market for consortium-based OTs and OTs in general, it certainly isn't, like Jim pointed out, not 100% of the market. You know, it's, but it is probably in DoD at least 50%. And that's now above 50, 55, almost $60 billion, excuse me. That's a huge, you know, that shows you, you know, an awful lot of runway left before you start even really exploiting the addressable market, if you will. So I see the trend continuing to go up because more and more people are going to realize this is one way to go. And one other comment that I wanted to make about the procurement side of things. You know, the ability to smoothly go from prototypes, which is what the 2371B consortia do, to procurement is still relatively new authority. You know, the ability to do that is still relatively new. It's only a few years old, and it's starting to grow dramatically. I know the Information Warfare Research Program, which is one of the Navy's consortia, has 12 prototypes that have moved into procurement, and I agree that it might be a little easier to move software and stuff like that into production, but the point is it's happening and it's starting to grow. Only a few years ago there was 0, you know, and now there's 12 in that space. Up in the ground vehicles arena up there and outside of Detroit, they're moving. I think they've moved 5 or 6 to production out of that. So I think that's going to grow too, especially wherein these non-traditionals are at the point where they can be the prime for a production contract. Then they're going to start insisting on it being an OT contract.
So what I'm hearing is trending of we're on the hockey stick in terms of funding for OTs and going out to OTs. We're headed straight up. We don't see that slowing down, but we are going to see more production runs. Does that sound about right? Jason, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, I hope so, because that's where we want to go.
Well, of course you do.
I mean, if you're talking about Bob's numbers are fantastic, right? So the IWRP, I mean, it seems like it was about a year ago where they had 2. They were celebrating that they had their first 2, and now if we're up to like 12 or so, that's a huge growth of prototypes that have gone into production. And I think that having the authority to do that, I think, is fantastic, because now you can do it as a sole source. You don't have to go out. Well, the government doesn't have to go out for award. They could do it sole source if they like the company that they worked with that put the prototype together for them. It saves them time. It saves them money. It's a huge boost to this, not in our case, non-traditional, that put together a fantastic prototype, and hopefully will be number 13 or number 14. We'll see.
GovCons, this is where the money is, and we love us some sole source, right? Like who doesn't want a sole source from the government, especially if you've got the past performance, you went it through all of the prototyping. Cash the check, man. Cash the check. Get the production.
Yep. So
let's not forget that. But let's not forget that prototype was competitively awarded to begin with. So it's not like it's every time you use the word sole source, a lot of people in their head say sweetheart deal, which it certainly isn't. You know this. And that's
there was a heck of a lot of work before that, right?
Yes,
and a lot more stuff going on in the thing. That's kind of like taking the victory lap on the last 30 seconds, right? Where you're like all the hard work that you did at the gym and all the other things that you did we're already there. You're the overnight success story, however, that took 15 years. Everybody in this industry.
And there, I mean, it's not a for sure thing. You have to hit some gates to be able to even be applicable to have that follow-on production contract. And your customer could say, nah, we're going to compete it. So it's not a guaranteed thing.
Nothing is guaranteed in GovCon. Right. I think we've all realized that, having been in the industry way too long. So what are we seeing in terms of trends for the type of technology? So we know we all say, yes, we're going to see more money on these vehicles. Yes, consortium and firms or consortia seems to be the way that a lot of them are going. We know we're going to hit to production and get more and more, and hopefully a lot more non-traditionals getting to the production stage. But is there a specific type of technology or a specific area that anyone's seeing some trending in? Or is it just generally, hey, all things are R&D? Any thoughts on this?
So from our, I'm down here at like the 1,000-foot level, and Bob and Jim are, so I'm flying somewhere way above me. But from the small business perspective, the things that we're seeing in the consortiums that we're tracking, and we're members of about 6 of them, and then we kind of keep tabs on a few as well. But one trend that we've seen over the last year, there's been a lot of activity with 5G. So the DoD has been seems to be very interested in 5G, both Navy and Air Force, that I've seen personally. So I think that's an interesting area that they're going into. Yep, hot place. And then the other trend is kind of more near and dear to our heart. We're more on the mechanical engineering and manufacturing side of things. We're seeing a trend in obsolescence. So military hardware that has hit some level of obsolescence and it needs a tech refresh. That could be circuit cards or enclosures or whatever. And so we're seeing a trend in that direction. And in fact, one of the consortiums that just started business here, congratulations to ATI for getting that one from Philadelphia, but that one will be focused in obsolescence. So there's nothing more that a mechanical engineering firm would love to do is to help tech refresh parts and pieces that have been deemed obsolete or things or gaps they have that they now identified that need to be filled. So that's kind of what we're seeing.
I like that topic. And go ahead, Bob. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I'm glad Jason mentioned the consortium up in Philadelphia, because that's something we've been working on, because it has to do with sustainment. Obsolescence is a part of it, but the idea is, how do we sustain things, these huge platforms that are incredibly expensive to replace, and keep them going, and the application of OTs and the consortium model to sustainment now, I think, is a big breakthrough, and I'd like to see it in some other areas besides shipbuilding, but they're certainly blazing the path, and I think that's going to be, or ship maintenance, I should say. I think we're pretty excited about that.
I think personally, and this is an overused term, but supply chain. If anything, the last year and a half has showed us, it's like, how will, as we talk about we've been talking about obsolescence in the US government for 30 years. So it's like, it's now catching up. And so I think the supply chain and the impacts felt over the past 18 months will absolutely be kind of a wave of the future. Jim, what do you think?
The other area we see a lot of the consortium spend going to is like information warfare, command control, communications, and cyberspace is a big one. So that kind of cyber related area as well.
And that's not going away. That's not going away anytime. Like, that's just for here to stay, I think.
Yeah, and of course, with the news lately on hypervelocity and things like that, we're going to see a lot of hypersonics. I think we'll see a lot more money going into hypersonics. But I want to mention one other quick thing, and that's that a few years ago, they added some words to the definition of prototyping that include business process improvement as a prototype that you can use 2371B to go after. And the sustainment world might be where we break through that, because the law itself is appropriation agnostic. Now, you might get some arguments from a few general counsels that have very narrow view, but when I talk to people on the Hill, their intention is to not make it any specific appropriation. So therefore, if you, such as supply chain issues, if you have a supply chain issue and you think you want to build a prototype to solve a particular problem, and you are an O&M funded activity, you may be able to use an OT to solve that problem. And so I think that's an important area where we may see some growth and get after some problems that heretofore haven't lent themselves to the R&D type appropriation organizations.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about, if anyone is up for this, the difference between kind of the various DoD agencies agencies and DoD versus civilian as it pertains to OTs. And if there's anything that folks should know as they're kind of hunting down or developing strategies for next year. Any notable differences on how they operate, how they think about OTs, starting off at the highest level between DoD and civilian?
Well, you should know that, the agencies have different authorities. So,
Right, and
so,
a good
so
point
the
is
work,
that not every agency has the authority, so that's the first step.
and some agencies have different, the characterization of what they can fund with using another transaction is different depending on the agencies. You know, DOD's is, that's a huge organization that operates under basically one authority with two parts, But for instance, the Transportation Security Agency, TSA, has unrestricted other transaction authority capability. So they can go, in fact, they fund a number of contractor operated security screening centers at different airports using other transactions, because they have that authority. So you have to look at different agencies. We recently won a consortia with the National Science Foundation for America's Data Hub, which is it's a consortia to go after new ways of dealing with data, massive amounts of data, analysis, protection, transmission, whatever it takes. And they're using an authority, which actually, it just slipped my mind what it was called, but it's not called other transaction, but it sure looks a lot like it. So so each agency, you have to look at the actual, because it's agency by agency, and sometimes agencies within agencies have different authorities. And so you have to look at that to see what they're able to fund and how they can fund it. But you're right, this isn't new.
Bob, a lack of standardization in the government? Are you kidding? How could this be?
Yeah.
Jim?
Yeah, I think it's OTA just by itself. It's almost like a square rectangle situation, right? There are the kind of capital O OTAs that we're talking about with the consortia and very traditional R&D and whatnot, but small OTA, small case, there are things like SIBRs, Small Business Innovation Research, and other types of non-traditional or non-FAR based acquisition authorities that agencies have and that you need to explore. And small business are saying, hey, I can barely understand what we're talking about. Now you're telling me there's a bunch of other things and I got to look at every agency.
Right.
Sadly,
Thanks,
the answer is yeah, to some degree, you do. You need to, again, who's going to buy what you're selling? I need to understand what their authorities are because they may have a variety of options they can use. And so, I'd be like beating a dead horse with the education piece, but if, understand that your customer may not know or probably doesn't know all the options at their disposal to get what you're selling. And so the more you understand and what their options are and can explain it to them, the better.
Absolutely. I think this all starts, unfortunately, with the fact that there is no magic bullet. You have to have something that the government actually wants to buy, but then you've got to do the research, right? And as we've talked about, you've got two types of pursuits. One is start with your customer, potentially have to do education and figure out what vehicle they have access to. The other is the consortium model where you join the consortium where you may not, but you're with like-minded people and you go after and collaborate and then go after certain procurements that you wouldn't normally know about. So it's kind of like your capture strategy has to take both into consideration. And then depending on the agency is how they, again, lack of standardization across the government, a novel concept. Meg has just mentioned it, but I want to also bring it up in case anyone has any questions. Please, by all means, feel free to throw them in the chat box or the Q&A. We will address them. I know we've only got 10 more minutes. Somehow we've made it through this hour without even realizing it. I want to actually throw it over. I believe we had a question from before that I will get to. But Jason, as you're planning out your capture strategy on behalf of industry, like what are your thoughts for next year? Like, are you, hey, I'm going to double down and go after different consortiums? Are you, hey, I want to bring my customer into the mix on what OTs are? I'm just curious.
So that's a great point. I mean, if you sit back and just monitor what the consortiums are able to acquire, opportunities on a quarterly basis or bi-monthly basis, you're just tracking and you're hoping that something interesting pops up, right? And then you're either excited or you're like, oh man, I guess I'll wait another couple months and see what comes out next. So you're really at the whim of what the customer needs help with, with each of the consortiums. So I think we've talked a little bit about going a step back and identifying the customer. And so you asked me what our goal is we have this OT mechanism. That's a great mechanism. We also have a couple of other contractual mechanisms at Alluvionic that allow us as an 8A to go directly to a customer, and we've got some mechanisms in place that would allow us to get on contract fairly quickly. But the hard part for small business, I think, is you can identify the customer, but getting to talk to the customer and having that free and open conversation ahead of time. That's a challenge. It's always been a challenge, I think. And so that's something that we'll be focusing on the next year. We've got some cool stuff to sell or further develop. Just need a little bit of help and some refinement from the customer, and it's finding those individuals at the right level within those organizations.
Sounds like a good strategy. Also sounds like a lot of work.
But
that's your job, right?
Yeah, and so I mean that's a good point, right? You know, we've talked about all of these agencies have all these OTAs. And I'm just a little guy. I don't have time to go look at all of them. You know, I've got to kind of focus on this where we think the sweet spot is, and for us, it's within the DoD, and lately it's been specifically into the Navy. So that's where a lot of our focus kind of tends to go, just because we have limited resources.
I think that's an excellent point, is know the customer, right? Follow the money. I always say this, but I'm like, it is, well, I mean, there are budgets, everything is public. Go follow the money. Who's actually buying the things that you sell? And you can't just say, oh, I'm going to go after OTs. That's not a strategy. It is a contract vehicle, and it is a way in, and it is a way around, and it's a way sideways, but it is not a let's go after every single agency. No company will be successful with that strategy. Not even the system integrators who are billion-dollar companies can pull that off. Like, you have to really go deep into, who's buying and where you are best received. And the vehicle is just the vehicle, right? It's the paper to get you to the paycheck, to get paid for your services. So as we're starting to wrap up, I want to see if I will ask each of you to go around the horn, if you don't mind, and give us your last final thoughts on what people can do as they're thinking about leveraging OTAs for growth in 2022 planning. Given that everybody's probably knee deep in BD strategy sessions over the next couple of weeks. Is there anyone who'd like to go first? And then Meg, let me also ask you if we've got anything coming in. If you do, please let us know. And if anyone is listening, for our listeners, please feel free to type in any questions or anything that you want to know out of our experts.
So I'll go first. I'll go quick because I'm probably Bob Jason have more relevant advice, but I'd say, since I know we have a lot of small businesses on the call, I'll just kind of go a little off script and say, one resource to learn or to have entry into an agency that you have at every agency is the Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization Office, the SADBU. And a lot of folks don't know about them. So I like to, whenever I talk to audiences that involve a lot of small businesses, remind them that there is somebody whose job it is to meet with you as a small business and to tell you about their agency and to try to make some connections and make you aware of what's going on there. In the SADBU is sort of the government nomenclature, the SADBU office, Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization. And, you can find those folks online pretty easily, and they will take your call. And they will hear your capability brief, and they will, if they're good, and most of them are very good and committed to what they do, will try to connect you with the parts of their organization that might need what you have. So I just throw that out there as information, and I'll toss it to my colleagues.
All right, Bob, what do you got?
I saw Jason unmute. I thought he wanted to go next. Hey, look. We work very hard to make sure that we aren't hard to find, and the consortium we manage aren't hard to find. As we mentioned earlier, we're very passionate about our mission as a public service nonprofit. And we manage, roughly half of the consortium that are out there. So, and most of those consortium, by the way, have very low barriers to entry. $500 is a typical annual dues. And oh, by the way, a lot of the consortium, several of the consortium have suspended dues, and a lot of them have rules where you can get involved before you actually join, but you have to join, for instance, before you can take an award, something like that. So kind of take a look at it. But if you need the one-stop shop place to go to ati.org and look at ours, and get a hold of somebody at ATI. They'll point you in the right direction. They'll give you great advice on especially as a traditional. Non-traditionals are anywhere around 75% of the membership of all these consortia. So it's not like you're by yourself up against all the big boys all the time. It's really, like I said, a very collaborative environment. And so, so if you're interested in getting involved in this sort of thing, that's certainly you can. The biggest bang for your buck is going to get on ati.org and start looking around there.
Okay, thank you. Jason, final thoughts?
Yeah, I think just final thoughts. It kind of wraps up to some of the things that we talked about at the beginning and probably through the middle of the conversation today, which was fantastic, by the way. This is great to be part of this conversation. But I think the big thing is just to kind of keep in mind this: it's a tool, you know, an OTA is a tool. There's nothing cosmic about it. It's just another contracting mechanism that's out there. It'll work for some, but not everything that you want to do. I think it's important to diversify your thoughts and where you're looking for opportunities and the kind of companies that you want to partner with. And really it goes back to, you know, collaboration is important, and you'll find the collaboration within a consortium, but you'll also find collaboration outside of consortiums with other businesses that are across town or across the country that you just happen to know through, you guys know how it goes, however you happen to know. And so I think those pieces are important, and then really it comes back to knowing your customer. If you have something to sell, that's great. If what you have to sell is a service of some kind that would help that customer, it's just as important to try to figure out who that customer is, how to contact them. If it's through a consortium, great. If it's not, try to figure out those means. I love the idea of the small business rep at the base level or at the agency level as a way in. They're not going to know everything. Come prepared to help them help you as far as where you're looking to go. And I think that would be well received by anyone that's in that kind of a job because they do want to be helpful, but they may need some help from you. So there's a lot of onus on the business to kind of make those conversations happen at the right level and kind of point them in the right direction. So yeah, just kind of some final thoughts there.
I think that's a really good point. We do have a question on what's the biggest or most common mistakes that small businesses make when chasing OTAs. Anyone want to take a quick gander at this? My initial thought is they go after too many and aren't focused on what we just said, either the capability or the customer. Anybody else have an opinion?
I don't, but I'd like what we keep hitting on 2 or 3 times, which is make sure you have something to sell and make sure you know how to communicate how important and innovative it is. And then get involved in some of these fora, you know, and start talking to people. But I can't think of, I'm probably not the right person to ask about what mistakes they make.
Jim, have you seen anything or witnessed anything from your side of it, knowing that you deal with a lot of different size companies?
I mean, I think we've covered it, right? It's people hear about this in passing and think it's some sort of magic bullet to greater revenue. And I think the mistake is, if any, just not understanding it's yet another tool. You need to understand when and how to use it. Like Bob said, maybe the first one out of the box every time for some companies. It may be one that's tucked in the back gathering dust for others, but still there and needed sometimes. And I think the other advice is like Jason hit, and I think he had something to say on this. I saw him come off mute, but it's that diversity, right? Diversify. Have lots of tools in the box.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say something that it wasn't necessarily a mistake, but it could have been, and it was trying to join too many consortiums up front without really understanding what it was. We did a huge, data poll across the web of what we could find and tried to rack and stack, and really it came down to just kind of focusing on 2 or 3 at first until we really understood the rhythm, what was available, because they're all slightly different. And so I would try not to spread yourself too thin.
They each have their own DNA. They each have their own way, their own battle rhythm, their own way, and so you have to get to really learn them. I think that's a really great point. You can't join 10 and expect it's going to just rain contracts. It doesn't work that way. You've got to put in the work too. And I think your point, Jim, about it's a vehicle, right? It's a tool and one of many. And hopefully, as long as you've got something to sell and sell it at a reasonable price, hopefully you'll be successful. Well, I want to thank everybody so much for coming. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to our panelists for being on our panel today. We appreciate it. And thank you all for your time. If you have any follow-up questions, I almost forgot, and this is why I have notes. I have 2 things for you. We will have our next institute. We're going to be talking about the Polaris contract. Who's excited for that? Maybe some people, maybe not for others. And so we'll have more coming out on that. That will be on Monday, November 8th. And then for those of you who may already be ATI consortium members, GovMates will be doing an exclusive for ATI members only matchmaking session, and the information should be in your email somewhere, but if not, feel free to reach out to us. The matchmaking session is going to be held with, I think we have 18, 19, 20 buyers and counting and still growing and it'll be held virtually on November 16th. So we'd love to see you guys participate, and we'd like to make some really good introductions. So this is the GovMates team. If anyone would like to reach out to us on LinkedIn, we'd love to chat with you and are happy to put you in touch with speakers and do all the things. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.